The wind howled over the flat, frost-bitten farmland of New Haven, Ohio, on the night of January 17, 1856. The sky, for weeks choked by snow clouds, had cleared just in time for an event whispered about by both learned men and wary farmers alike. A total lunar eclipse, the first in nearly 2 decades, visible from the heartland with an eerie blood-red hue that turned the moon into something almost living. The town's modest population, just under 200 souls, watched the heavens with unease rather than awe. Eclipse or not, there had already been strange happenings. Crops rotted prematurely in early autumn. Livestock gave birth to stillborns with malformed limbs. Churchgoers spoke of hearing chants in unfamiliar tongues drifting from the woods at night. Amid this atmosphere of quiet dread, 3 cries broke the dead silence of a snowbound night. Inside a weather-worn farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a woman labored alone. Her name was Miriam Alcott, a midwife by trade, who had long accepted the burden of solitude after her husband, a railway worker, vanished near Lake Erie during a bridge collapse. The townsfolk respected her, but from a safe distance. Miriam was known for tending to those whom the church deemed untouchable. Unwed mothers, fevered drunks, the mentally ill. She never turned anyone away. No one had known she was pregnant, not a neighbor, not a shopkeeper, not even the Reverend Harlan, who often brought her firewood in the harsher months. Her figure had not changed. Her habits had remained constant. But that night, as the moon turned red, Miriam delivered not 1 child, but 3. No lanterns glowed in her windows. No witnesses were present save for the frost-laced glass and the red light pouring through it. Later, she would say she hadn't known she was carrying at all. She'd awakened to sharp pains and assumed some punishment of the womb. But as the pain worsened, so did the feeling of something watching. She said later it wasn't pain that made her scream, but the certainty that she was not alone in the room even before the first child came. Elijah was born first, just before midnight. Elias followed 5 minutes later. Eliza emerged precisely at the stroke of 12, as the eclipse reached full shadow and the moon hung fully bloodied in the night sky. They were not loud, as newborns usually are. Their cries were sharp, brief, and synchronized, as though something inside them knew to speak only in exact rhythm. Their skin was pale as milk and nearly translucent, with veins like dark threads dancing beneath. Their eyes opened immediately, again all at once. They didn't search or dart like a newborn's eyes should. They stared straight up at Miriam as if recognizing her. That, she said, chilled her more than the wind that clawed at the walls outside. What no one could explain, not in 1856, not now, was the mark. Each child bore a curious symbol, almost like a branded scar, just above the heart. The marks were identical. They resembled a triangle with a circle in its center, intersected by a vertical line that bled past both shapes. A local school teacher, one of the few literate in classical languages, identified it as vaguely alchemical, possibly an esoteric representation of spirit bound by form. Whatever it meant, it was not something passed by blood or birth. The next morning, despite the snow still falling, Miriam wrapped each of the triplets in wool and walked the 3 miles to the church at the center of town. Her appearance at the chapel, barefoot and half-frozen, stunned the congregation. She didn't speak. She simply handed the children one by one to Reverend Harlan. He would later tell the town council that he looked into their eyes and felt not fear, but a humbling sense of being outnumbered. They stared not like children, but like entities who knew more than they had any right to. Reverend Harlan took them in. He believed the church could protect them, teach them, mold them into God's image, as he said in his journal. But whispers spread through New Haven with startling speed. No one had seen Miriam pregnant. The children had no father, born during an eclipse, marked with occult symbols, too quiet, too aware, too in sync. Some said they were angels, others demons. Some feared they were neither, just wrong, not a part of anything that belonged on this earth. By the end of the week, Miriam vanished. Her home was found abandoned, her hearth cold. A neighbor reported seeing her walking into the woods behind her home in the dead of night, barefoot again, wearing nothing but a gray shawl. No search party was organized. No one wanted to know what might be found in those woods. The triplets, meanwhile, grew quickly and in perfect alignment. Their movements were strange even as infants. When one cried, the others cried with the same pitch and rhythm. When one raised a hand, the others mirrored it, even when placed in separate rooms. Their vitals matched, their sleeping cycles aligned. Doctors from neighboring towns were brought in to examine them. None could offer an explanation. One physician, Dr. Ames from Cincinnati, declared them a living miracle of synchronized development. He left the following morning without taking his payment, never to return. By their second birthday, the triplets had yet to speak, but they were not silent. They communicated. With each other, certainly, but also, perhaps, with others. A nun who helped care for them wrote in her diary that she awoke one night to find the three children standing silently at her bedside. She claimed they stared at her for 10 minutes before returning to their beds without a sound. She never returned to the church. Still, the Reverend remained hopeful, determined to treat the children not as an aberration, but as divine gifts, signs perhaps of some grand prophecy. But even he could not shake a growing discomfort. In one entry from March of that year, he wrote, "I've begun to feel duplicated, as though my thoughts are not entirely mine. I think of things I do not remember learning. I wake speaking names I do not recognize. This is not madness. This is something else." The triplets remained healthy, growing stronger and more alert by the day. But their presence altered the rhythm of New Haven. Dogs stopped barking. Clocks chimed a beat too slow. The wind sounded different through the trees. A local poet who lived near the church remarked that the air tasted metallic whenever the children were near. As spring approached, farmers began refusing to come into town. They said the shadows moved wrong, that they felt eyes watching from mirrors, that they heard voices, not loud but layered, as if three people were whispering at once, always just behind them. No one could explain any of it. Not the eclipse, not the birth, not the marks, and certainly not the feeling that the world itself had shifted, just slightly, on the night those children arrived. And it all began with a blood-red moon and three children who cried as one. From the moment Elijah, Elias, and Eliza were born, it was as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis. The midwife who delivered them, an old widow named Agnes Marin, refused to speak for 3 days after their birth, and when she finally did, voice trembled as she recounted the delivery. She claimed the room had dropped in temperature the moment the final child emerged, and for just a second, the lanterns flickered with no wind or breath to disturb them. She swore the air had felt heavy, like stone pressing down on her shoulders. And all three babies opened their eyes at the exact same moment, their gaze not on the mother, but on her. Their mother, Mercy Whitlock, had been strong and healthy up until the day of the delivery, but after the birth, she descended into silence, unable, or perhaps unwilling to speak. Some believed it was the trauma of delivering triplets. Others weren't so sure. Her husband, Silas Whitlock, a stern farmer known for his practical mind, told people it was exhaustion. Yet even he avoided the subject in later years as if the explanation weighed too heavily on his tongue. The children grew without illness or injury, something townsfolk considered a blessing at first. But as the months passed, an unsettling pattern became clear. The triplets moved as one. If one lifted a hand, so did the others. If Elijah turned his head toward a bird call, Elias and Eliza would mimic the gesture precisely, even if they weren't facing the sound. It became impossible to distinguish intention from imitation, and soon it appeared they weren't imitating at all, but somehow reacting in perfect unison, guided by an unseen force. By the time they were 3 years old, their peculiarity had become a source of dread rather than wonder. They still hadn't spoken. Not a sound beyond the occasional hum or ooh escaped their lips, and yet they navigated the world with eerie comprehension. They could pick up a tool, tie a rope, or stack bricks in symmetrical towers with no instruction. One of the town's school teachers, Miss Clarion, was so intrigued that she tried to test their intellect. She laid out puzzle boards and asked them to complete simple tasks. Not only did the children solve each puzzle rapidly, but they did so with identical movements, each placing pieces in the same order, with the same hand, at the same moment. Miss Clarion's fascination turned to fear when she attempted to separate them. She took Eliza into another room while leaving the boys behind, hoping to test their abilities individually. What happened next caused her to resign the following day. As soon as the door closed, Eliza let out a soundless cry, her mouth open, face twisted in agony. But no sound emerged. At the same moment, Elijah and Elias fell to the floor, convulsing. Miss Clarion rushed to reunite them, and the moment the triplets locked eyes, all three calmed instantly, sitting up as if nothing had occurred. After that, they were never separated again. The town's reaction shifted from confused curiosity to unease. Some called the triplets a miracle. Others whispered darker things. Old superstitions began to resurface, talk of changelings, omens, and curses. There were those who believed the children were touched by something not of this world, born not under the will of God, but beneath the influence of older, less merciful powers. The local preacher, Reverend Othram, urged calm, reminding the townsfolk of Christian charity, but even he kept his distance. When the children and their parents attended Sunday service, pews nearby mysteriously emptied, and yet the triplets never seemed bothered. They sat in perfect stillness, eyes fixed, not on the altar, but often on the congregation, scanning faces with unreadable expressions. The children remained eerily silent. No laughter, no crying, no screaming, just silence, thick and unnatural, clinging to them like fog. Their home, too, was quiet. Visitors spoke of entering the Whitlock farmhouse and feeling as if they had stepped into a crypt. Despite the presence of 3 young children, no noise echoed in the halls, no toys lay scattered, no signs of ordinary childhood mischief. The few who dared to enter said the triplets often watched from the staircase or the parlor, unmoving, as if measuring the intentions of those who crossed their threshold. By age 5, it was clear to all that something was terribly wrong or terribly different. A traveling phrenologist from Cincinnati, drawn by local stories, offered to examine them, convinced their condition was some rare neurological anomaly. Silas allowed it, desperate to understand his children's strangeness. The man stayed 3 nights. On the 4th morning, he left town in such a hurry he abandoned several instruments behind, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. Then came the animals. Farmers began finding livestock dead in the fields, perfectly intact. Not a drop of blood spilled, no sign of struggle, just lifeless. Chickens, lambs, even dogs, always near the Whitlock property. Silas denied involvement, but more than one person saw the triplets standing in the fields at dusk, their arms outstretched, as if listening to something only they could hear. Mercy, once so vibrant, now wandered aimlessly through town, barefoot and muttering. She stopped responding to greetings, staring through people with unblinking eyes. Things reached a breaking point when young Jacob Lorne, a neighbor's boy, went missing. Search parties scoured the woods and fields for days. On the third morning, Jacob was found on the steps of the church, shivering, barefoot, and unable to speak. He had no memory of what happened, only that he had followed something into the woods. When shown a sketch of the triplets, he burst into tears. No one asked further. The Whitlocks withdrew entirely after that, rarely leaving their home. Silas constructed high fences around the property, and strangers were no longer welcomed. Still, those nearby swore they could hear odd rhythms at night. 3 sets of footsteps pacing in unison across wooden floors over and over, never stopping. What troubled people most wasn't these strange abilities or the synchronized movements. It was the sense that the triplets weren't truly children, not in the way others were. They lacked curiosity, never asked questions, never played. Their gaze was too steady, too knowing. One local woman, widowed and half-mad from grief, called them mirrors of something that should not be. Her words haunted the town long after she vanished into the woods one winter, never to return. There were moments when hope flickered. Times when Silas would bring them to town, and they'd simply sit, still and obedient, watching everything with those glassy, storm-colored eyes. But inevitably, something would happen. A dog would whimper and back away. A baby would scream uncontrollably. An old man once dropped dead right in front of them. The physician said it was his heart, but no one truly believed that. By their 6th year, even science had given up. No explanation could be found, no treatment, no diagnosis. They were studied, observed, tested, and still they remained an enigma. No learning, no language, no change. Just 3 silent children, moving like shadows across the landscape of a town that no longer knew what to do with them. And as time passed, a deeper dread settled in, not of what the triplets had done, but of what they might become. The late summer of 1863 brought with it not only a harvest spoiled by drought, but a sense of growing dread that clung to New Haven like mildew. What had once been curious murmurs about the triplets had ripened into outright fear. By then, Elijah, Elias, and Eliza were 7 years old, and the townsfolk had grown weary of pretending their presence wasn't unsettling. Their expressions never changed. Their eyes moved as one, and when they walked through the square, each step in perfect synchronicity, the blacksmith's wife would clutch her rosary and cross the street, whispering prayers in German under her breath. Reverend Josiah Parson had tolerated the murmurs for as long as he could. A devout man and long-time spiritual anchor in the community, he had always believed fear grew strongest where faith was weakest. He often said so from the pulpit, voice booming through the modest church, but over time, even he could not ignore what was unfolding. There had been the incident with Mrs. Carlyle's baby, who screamed for hours whenever the triplets were near, and fell into a coma-like sleep the moment they left the house. There had been the dogs that barked and whined without cause when they passed, and more than once, someone had claimed to hear whispers coming from nowhere when the children were around, soft, discordant syllables in a language no one recognized. Reverend Parsons' breaking point came on a sweltering August evening when his youngest daughter, Mary Ann, failed to return from the well. After a frantic search, she was found at the edge of the woods near the Harper farm, standing completely still with her eyes rolled back into her skull, murmuring phrases in a hoarse voice that was not her own. When she finally collapsed into her father's arms, she could not remember how she got there, or who the 3 shadows were that she had mentioned in her daze. That night, Reverend Parson did what no one else had dared to do. He went to the Macabre homestead where the triplets lived with their mother, Cora. She had grown quiet and strange over the years, her eyes sunken and voice brittle as rusted tin. She met the Reverend at the door as if expecting him. "I've prayed for you to come," she said simply, stepping aside. The children were upstairs, seated on the floor in a perfect triangle, motionless. They did not look up when Parson entered. He claimed later that he felt a pressure in his chest the moment he crossed the threshold, like the air had thickened into syrup. Still, he knelt and began to pray. Over the next week, Reverend Parson insisted on performing what he called a spiritual cleansing. It wasn't a full exorcism, he said. He did not believe in Catholic rites, but rather a purging of the unnatural energies he sensed within the children. He fasted. He anointed the house with oil. He recited scripture from dawn until the stroke of midnight. Yet each day, the children sat in that same triangle. They never flinched, never blinked. And when he paused, their mouths would open, not to speak, but to exhale in unison, as if expelling something invisible into the room. He kept a journal of the experience, which would later be found by investigators charred and half gone. In the surviving pages, Parson wrote of strange dreams and sudden nosebleeds, of waking to find that his crucifix had melted into the floorboards. He described a moment, 3 days into the ritual, when he tried to lift his Bible and found it had fused shut, its pages sealed like skin. He began to doubt himself. He wrote that he no longer felt the presence of God in the house. Then came the fire. It began at midnight on the 7th day. Witnesses later claimed the blaze erupted all at once, not gradually, but with the sudden fury of a lightning strike. Flames shot from the windows of the parsonage, and by the time the town bell rang to summon help, the building was engulfed. Parson's wife and daughters were trapped inside. Of Reverend Parson, there was no sign, until someone spotted him through an upper window, arms outstretched, mouth agape in a silent scream as fire devoured the room around him. But the strangest part, the part no one could explain, was what was found on the lawn just beyond the flames. The triplets stood there side by side, watching, unblinking, untouched by soot or smoke. Their white nightclothes billowed in the hot wind like the robes of tiny prophets. They said nothing. They did not move. The town sheriff tried to question them, but the moment he approached, his lantern exploded in his hand, sending shards of glass into his neck. He survived, but never returned to duty. After the fire was extinguished, investigators searched the wreckage. The cause was ruled undetermined. No accelerants, no faulty wiring, nothing natural or man-made. Reverend Parson's journal was discovered near the remnants of his desk, burned at the edges but legible in parts. The final entry was dated just hours before the blaze. It read only, "They are not children. They wear the shape of children, but they are not." The town held a service for the Parson family, but few attended. Fear had settled too deeply. Whispers filled the pews, accusations unspoken, but understood. Cora Macabre did not show her face again. She boarded up her windows and refused all visitors. Some claimed she'd lost her mind. Others believed she finally saw the truth in her children. Over the next year, strange happenings quieted, but did not cease. Crops failed without reason. Cattle birthed stillborn calves with odd spirals etched into their skin, and on several occasions, Children in the village went missing for hours, only to be found standing in silence near the old parsonage ruins, staring into the scorched ground as if waiting for something. No one blamed the triplets outright, not publicly, but their presence became like a stain no prayer could cleanse. They remained in town until the winter of 1872, when they vanished as mysteriously as they had arrived, leaving behind no trace, only a perfect scorched triangle in the snow outside the McGorry home. Elijah, Elias, Eliza gone. And the town breathed easier until the day 3 more were born. They arrived in early autumn, a cadre of esteemed minds from Boston and New York, men of medicine, logic, and curiosity. Word of the Ohio triplets had traveled far beyond the rolling hills of New Haven, carried by whispers from clergy, travelers, and an anonymous letter published in a fringe spiritualist journal. The missive described children who moved as one, shared thoughts without speech, and who had never once shed a tear or raised their voice. Most dismissed it as frontier folklore, but not Dr. Jonathan Ellery. Dr. Ellery, a rising neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, had a particular interest in shared cognition and anomalous neurological links among siblings. He had documented cases of twins who claimed to feel each other's pain, but nothing had prepared him for the descriptions of the Norwood triplets. He convinced 2 colleagues, a biologist, Dr. Abram Keene, and a fringe psychologist and mesmerist, Professor Wilhelm Klein, to accompany him. They arrived in New Haven under the guise of offering educational insight and free medical care to rural families, but the town knew their true intent. The triplets, now 11 years old, were unnaturally pale with dark, sunken eyes that belied their youth. Elijah, Elias, and Eliza Norwood each bore the same crescent-shaped mark behind their left ears, too symmetrical, too precise to be coincidence. They were eerily quiet, often staring straight ahead unless called by name, and even then only blinking in acknowledgement. What unnerved Dr. Ellery most was not their silence, but their gaze. When he looked into their eyes, he felt, as did the others, that something was looking back, assessing him with ancient, calculating disinterest. The examination began with the basics: reflexes, motor skills, heart rate. All were normal, if not slightly too perfect. The children showed no variance in response time, even when tested separately. Their heartbeats, measured simultaneously, remained in rhythm throughout the hour-long tests. Even when startled, they reacted identically, mouths twitching just so, shoulders tightening at the same angle. There were no words between them, no subtle gestures, yet they moved as if operated by the same unseen hand. Dr. Keene, the biologist, collected blood samples. He was particularly interested in genetic anomalies, but when he studied the samples under his field microscope, he turned pale. He didn't elaborate at first, but later, in confidence to Ellery, he muttered that the blood appeared to respond to light differently than any he'd studied, clotting rapidly when exposed to certain frequencies. When asked if it could be due to sample contamination, he merely shook his head. Professor Klein, more open to the supernatural than his colleagues, believed the triplets were conduits, perhaps vessels for a shared consciousness. On the 3rd day, he attempted an experiment he called mirrored mesmerism. He placed each child in a separate room in the Norwood farmhouse, then hypnotized one, Eliza, with a pendulum. As Eliza's eyes glazed over, Elias and Elijah, rooms apart, out of earshot, entered the same state within minutes. When he instructed Eliza to raise her right hand, the boys did so in unison. That night, Klein could not sleep. He claimed to hear whispering through the walls, not in English or any tongue he recognized. When he looked out the window, he thought he saw the triplets standing in the yard, though they had been locked in their rooms. He later admitted he didn't check the doors. By the 5th day, the tension among the scientists was palpable. Dr. Ellery wanted to bring the children to Boston for further study. The mother, Miriam Norwood, refused, despite their promise of compensation and care. She was a solemn, grieving woman, her face drawn with years of quiet dread. She rarely left the children alone. Once, when Dr. Keene insisted on isolating Elias for overnight observation, she reportedly spat on the floor and muttered, "Separate them and you risk your soul." The next morning, Keene was gone. His bed was made, his coat still hanging on the chair. His journal, locked the night before, was lying open on the floor. The handwriting on the final page had shifted wildly from the crisp script of the previous entries. It was frantic, almost illegible. The last line, underlined repeatedly, read, "They are not three, they are one." A search party combed the surrounding fields, woods, and creeks. No tracks, no signs of struggle. The authorities from the nearest township were summoned, but their involvement was half-hearted. Some of the deputies crossed themselves just approaching the Norwood property. In the absence of evidence, the official conclusion was that Dr. Keene had succumbed to stress and wandered off. Ellery, now visibly shaken, confronted the mother again. She offered no apology, only a chilling suggestion. "He looked too long at what doesn't want to be understood." Despite the setback, Ellery pressed forward. He began documenting his findings obsessively, even going so far as to sketch the birthmarks, which he now believed were sigils rather than natural blemishes. The symbol, a circle intersected by a diagonal line with 3 notches, appeared in a 16th century grimoire he once saw in a Harvard archive. He didn't mention this to Klein. Klein, meanwhile, had become withdrawn. He no longer spoke during meals and refused to be alone in any room. He claimed the children were speaking to him in dreams, always in triplicate, always in riddles. One morning he awoke with a bleeding nose and a phrase carved faintly into his chest, "Divide us not." He insisted he hadn't done it himself. On the 7th day, Ellery called off the study. His notes, while extensive, ended mid-sentence. He made arrangements to leave New Haven and quietly advised Klein to do the same. The professor didn't answer. That evening, the town's physician, who had been helping with the logistics of the study, found Ellery in his quarters, seated at his desk, staring at the wall. His eyes were open, but he was unresponsive. He remained that way until his transport arrived. By the time he reached Boston, he had no memory of the past week. As for Klein, he remained in town one more night. He was last seen walking toward the Norwood property with a satchel. Some say he was drawn there, others say he never left. The satchel was later found by the creek, filled with old books and a single candle, half melted. The triplets continued to live with their mother, untouched by the inquiries and unbothered by the disappearances. They resumed their silent routines, walking through the town square on rare occasions, always together, always in rhythm. By the time winter fell, few in New Haven dared speak of what happened that autumn. What little remains, journals, half-burned sketches, fragmented records, has been kept in a locked cabinet at the New Haven Historical Society, but no amount of retelling or examination has offered a satisfactory answer to what science failed to explain. Only one thing is certain. Those who got too close never came away unchanged. It was December of 1872 when the first real snow blanketed New Haven in a silence so complete it felt as though time itself had stopped. The townsfolk, weathered by years of unease surrounding the triplets, had grown used to small, inexplicable disturbances. Objects moved on their own, animals went missing, whispers heard in the cornfields, but none of it prepared them for that night. By then, Elijah, Elias, and Eliza were 16. They rarely spoke, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. Anyone who spent more than 5 minutes in their presence could see it, how their eyes followed the same path, how they breathed as one, how their movements mirrored each other like reflections in rippling water. The townspeople kept their distance, fearful but curious, unsure whether the siblings were cursed, divine, or something else entirely. They lived in a modest house at the edge of the woods, watched over by their aging aunt, Martha Langley. She was the only one who hadn't abandoned them, not because she didn't believe in the stories, but because she had no choice. Their mother had died moments after childbirth, screaming of 3 watchers in the dark, and their father had vanished 6 months later, leaving only a torn Bible and a cryptic letter no one could decipher. Martha raised them, fed them, clothed them, and prayed every night. But she never went into their rooms after dark. Not once. The day had begun with a biting chill, the sort of cold that made the air brittle. The snow started at noon and thickened into night, cloaking the town in white. But something about it felt unnatural. The wind moved strangely, twisting, circling, not like a storm, but like something breathing. Martha, who always locked the house at sundown, claimed later that she had bolted every window, checked every latch, and yet just past midnight, when she rose to use the chamber pot, she found the front door wide open. No footprints in the snow, no broken locks, just silence. And the children were gone. Panic took her for a moment, as it always had when they vanished from sight, but she fought it back. They were never normal, she reminded herself. Perhaps they were walking in their sleep, or communing the way they did sometimes, shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed, mouths murmuring words that weren't English or any language she'd ever heard. But when she stepped outside, her breath catching in her throat from the cold, she saw something she could not unsee. A circle had been formed in the snow, almost perfect in shape, with scorched edges where the frost had melted into a darkened ring of earth. In the center, the triplets' birthmark symbol, outlined in what looked like soot, or maybe ash. There were no prints leading in, no prints leading out. The sheriff was called at dawn. His men searched the woods, the river, even beneath the frozen lake. Dogs refused to track. Compasses spun without direction. Every path led back to that circle. The symbol remained undisturbed for days, even after snow continued to fall. Nothing could cover it. Some said it glowed faintly at night. The town fell into a hush, deeper than usual. A memorial was never held. No funerals, no graves, just quiet. And questions. And the aching dread that maybe, just maybe, they were never really children at all. Weeks passed, then months. Martha wasted away in that house, insisting she still heard them upstairs. She swore she'd seen them walking the fields at dusk, their outlines just visible behind the tree line. Others dismissed her as mad, but more than one resident heard strange tapping on their windows late at night. Always 3 knocks, always silent when checked. A letter arrived at the New Haven post office 6 months later, addressed to no one, with no return address. It was just a page torn from a medical journal, one used by Dr. William Harrow, one of the scientists who had visited the triplets years prior. On the page was a sketch of the same symbol that marked the scorched ground, drawn in ink that appeared to have been mixed with blood. Scrawled beneath it were just 4 words. They are not gone. Nothing more came of it. The trail went cold. Eventually, the town stopped asking questions, and the story became just that, a story, a dark piece of local folklore, told in hushed tones near the fire. But the truth never settled. Decades later, in the early 20th century, a land surveyor mapping old boundaries near the Langley estate claimed to have found something deep in the woods, a clearing he'd never seen before, even though he'd been through the area a dozen times. In its center, 3 trees growing from a shared root, their trunks twisted unnaturally, bark blackened as if burned. He swore he heard whispers as he approached, and fled without recording coordinates. He quit his job that same week. Others would report similar findings over the years, always in threes. 3 shadows in a mirror, 3 candles flickering without wind, 3 voices humming a lullaby no one had taught them, and always the same symbol appearing in chalk, ash, or frost. Each time it vanished before it could be studied. In 1962, a folklore professor from Ohio State visited New Haven to document the legend. His field notes described a disturbing incident. He claimed to have found the original Langley house still standing, despite official records saying it had burned down in 1913. Inside, in the upstairs room once used by the triplets, he found children's toys arranged in threes, untouched by time, and a cracked mirror with "We Remember" scrawled across the glass. He left that night and never published his finding. His notes were found in his attic after his death, sealed in a lead box. To this day, the triplets' disappearance remains unsolved. No bones, no clothing, no sign of death. Just that scorched symbol, the one not even science has been able to explain. The renovation of New Haven's historical archives began with little fanfare. A group of graduate students and historians from the Ohio Historical Society arrived in the near-abandoned village, armed with scanners, notebooks, and optimism. The archives, tucked away in the basement of what had once been the town's church, were mostly forgotten, a mildewed trove of old tax records, sermons, and town meeting minutes. Dust thickened the air like smoke, and the single yellow bulb swinging from the ceiling buzzed louder than the students talked. It was mundane work. At least it was supposed to be. It began with a ledger, fragile, bound in cracking leather, the spine nearly disintegrated. A graduate assistant flipped it open to a page dated October 3rd, 1856. Inside were written accounts of the triplets' birth. The ink, faded but legible, told of an eclipse and a mother named Miriam Harrow. She had given birth to 3 identical children, Elijah, Elias, and Eliza. The names sent a chill through the small group, though none could say exactly why. Even stranger was the notation scribbled in the margin. Marked by Saturn's eye, not of this world. At first they laughed it off. Every town has its folklore. But over the next few days, strange patterns began to emerge. Scanned documents corrupted inexplicably. Computers crashed when files involving the triplets were opened. Recordings made in the archive picked up soft whispers, 3 voices, whispering simultaneously in languages no one could identify. One night the power cut out, and a student swore they saw 3 shadows standing across the room, still and silent, until the lights flickered back on. No one else saw them. But the air felt colder after that, and no one wanted to be in the archives alone anymore. A professor named Dr. Leanna Murray took particular interest in the triplets' case. Her area of study was 19th century American spiritualism, and she had a penchant for digging too deep. She traced reports from the original investigation in the 1860s and found that the neurologists who had examined the children had dismissed their behavior as collective hysteria until one of their own, Dr. James Ashcroft, vanished without explanation. His last journal entry read, "They know I can hear them. They're inside the walls now." That same night, one of the students working with Dr. Murray, Isaac, awoke screaming in his rented room at the edge of town. His roommates said he'd been repeating the same 3 names over and over in perfect rhythm. When they shook him awake, he claimed he had been dreaming of standing in snow barefoot, staring at 3 children whose eyes were not human. He left town the next morning without saying goodbye. He would never return Dr. Murray's emails. The town itself began to shift subtly, as though waking from a long sleep. New Haven, nearly lifeless for decades, saw a curious resurgence. A young couple, moved into an old farmhouse not far from the church, unaware of its past. The woman, Julia, was pregnant. Triplets, the doctor said, all perfectly healthy and oddly, all sharing the same heartbeat pattern during ultrasounds. The couple laughed it off, a coincidence, rare but not impossible. On the day of the birth, July 21st, 2025, the moon turned red. Not a predicted eclipse, not a natural event that astronomers could explain. A blood moon that wasn't supposed to be there. Julia delivered 3 identical babies, all born in silence, not crying. Nurses said they were alert, watching. The delivery room lights flickered as the 3rd child emerged, and every clock in the hospital paused at 3:33 a.m. Each baby bore a strange mark beneath the left collarbone, a pattern resembling Saturn encircled by 3 interlocking rings. Doctors brushed it off as a birthmark, though one nurse reportedly quit her job and refused to speak about what she had seen. She moved states away within the week. Back in the archives, Dr. Murray was reviewing a video taken during one of their early visits. In the corner of the footage, 3 shadows stood for exactly 6 frames, unblinking, unmoving, then gone. She slowed the footage frame by frame. Each figure was small, child-sized, and standing directly behind her as she lectured on the historical timeline of the Harrow family. When she looked closer, she realized they weren't casting shadows. They were the shadows. She went to the farmhouse that same week. Julia welcomed her, wary but polite. The triplets, now just over 2 weeks old, were quiet, calm, too calm. They never cried. They never babbled. They simply stared. When Dr. Murray approached, all 3 turned their heads in perfect unison and fixed their gaze on her. She claimed she heard something in her mind, not words, not exactly, but impressions. Cold, silence, snow, fire, return. She left quickly and never returned. Her report to the Ohio Historical Society was brief and vague. She retired the following month and moved to a remote cabin in northern Canada. Her last public communication was an email to a colleague with one sentence: "They are not new." The couple raised the children in New Haven. Over time, the town seemed to adjust. People stopped asking questions. The local paper never mentioned the blood moon. Julia and her husband stopped speaking to neighbors. The children grew, never sick, never fussy, always together. By age 5, they spoke in perfect synchrony. Their voices echoed off walls strangely, not quite natural, like a recording played through damaged speakers. One winter evening during the town's holiday fair, a snowstorm swept in without warning. Whiteout conditions trapped dozens in the community center. Julia, now distant and cold, stood watching the snow through a window as her children played silently nearby. They stopped moving at exactly 3:33 p.m. Every clock in the building froze again. Then they turned to the crowd and spoke. No one would agree afterward on exactly what they said, only that the words weren't in English. Some described it as chanting. Others said it was more like tones, resonances that vibrated inside their heads rather than their ears. A woman collapsed, bleeding from her nose. Several children began crying uncontrollably, and an elderly man reportedly went blind. After that day, New Haven was never the same. Some moved away, others denied anything strange had occurred, and a few, those who stayed, began to act differently. In the coming months, more children were born in town, all unusually quiet, all with the same crescent-shaped birthmark beneath their collarbone. The archives remain closed now, officially due to structural concerns, but no one has attempted to fix it. The church's basement door is nailed shut. The local librarian claims she hears scratching from the other side some nights, 3 sets of fingernails always in unison. The story of the Harrow triplets has faded from local memory, replaced by whispers and warnings. But for those who know what to look for, the signs are everywhere. The snow never melts completely in certain parts of town. Lights flicker in the presence of children. And sometimes, just before 3:33 a.m., 3 faint voices whisper a name long forgotten. They are not new. They have returned. And this time they are not alone.